The Walking Dead is one of the greatest shows ever created, and across its decade runtime and 177 episodes, there are some truly phenomenal moments within the series. However, there are also some less phenomenal bits. And a few months ago on this channel, I went through every season of the series, saying what my favourite episode from each specific season was. And today, well, I thought we'd do the exact opposite. So, sit back, relax, as I delve into the world of The Walking Dead and say what my least favourite episode is from every single season of the main show. Now, Season 1 of The Walking Dead is without a doubt the hardest season to pick a definitive worst episode for, because frankly, they are all superb. It also doesn't help that there are only 6 episodes, but in my opinion the worst is Episode 5, titled Wildfire. And like I said, by no means is this a bad episode by any stretch of the imagination, but I think this is just the least memorable one. For example, when you think of the greatest scenes from Season 1 of The Walking Dead, you think Rick riding into the now abandoned Atlanta, the group discovering you can walk amongst the dead if you mask your scent, the Grimes family reunion, the mystery of the Vatos gang, or maybe even the explosion at the CDC. But every scene I have just mentioned takes place in the other 5 episodes of Season 1. And I think this episode just lacks that wow factor. Another reason as to why I've chosen it is it's the first real transitional episode in the entire series. Episodes 1 to 4 of the show had been high stakes, tense watches, but episode 5 slows that pace right down, and whilst yes, this was important from a storytelling aspect, from a viewing perspective, it just makes this one the least eventful. In this episode, we see our group deal with the cleanup from the Walker attack in the previous one, burn and mourn the dead, and then argue on what to do next, eventually settling on heading to the CDC. And of course, this episode does have some brilliant moments in it, like Shane and Rick's argument in the woods and Jim's death, but other than that, it largely is just dialogue. Now, I can't stress enough how important this episode is to the overall show. It slows the action right down, sets up some key narrative points such as the Shane and Rick dynamic, the journey to the CDC, and the group dealing with death for the first real time in the series. But due to just how excellent the other episodes are in Season 1, I think this one just comes in last by default. It lacks that spectacle that the other 5 episodes have, and we see little Walker action in it. Look, ultimately this is a good episode and necessary to the story, but the purpose of Wildfire was to get our characters from point A to point B, and also set up for the season finale. So for that reason, episode 5, in my opinion, is the worst in Season 1. Now, as many of you probably know, Season 2 of The Walking Dead is my favourite season of television on the planet, and we see the episode count jump from a measly 6 to a modest 13 here. Now, Season 2 heavily relies on character dialogue and slow, tense build-up towards its season finale, but due to this formula, there are a few episodes up for contention here. Firstly, episode 2, titled Bloodletting. In this episode, we see the immediate aftermath of Carl's gunshot wound, and we watch as our group relocate from the highway over to Herschel's farm. Again though, the story kind of stagnates in this episode, and little actually happens other than Shane making a promise to Rick that he'll make it back with the medical supplies for Carl. Another contender here for me is episode 5, called Chupacabra. Although this episode does well at fleshing out the character of Daryl, who up until this point we truthfully didn't know much about, it again ventures from the main storyline. There is a distinct lack of Rick, Shane and Carl in this specific episode, and I wasn't a huge fan of the whole Merle hallucination sequence. Whilst yes, it does show Daryl's emotional state at the time and his desire to deep down just be wanted, I found myself getting a tad bit bored, and whilst I do understand this episode would help to flesh out the character of Daryl and build the foundations for what he'd go on to become later down the line, I just found it a bit repetitive, and I hated the ending where Andrea shoots Daryl for seemingly no reason, especially from a narrative perspective. And Secrets, which is episode 6, I believe is fairly weak for Season 2's high standards, whilst also containing arguably the most disturbing scene in the entire series.
No! God, please, no!
But my personal least favourite episode in Season 2 of The Walking Dead is episode 4, titled Cherokee Rose. Now, I'd like to say I absolutely love the scene of Daryl and Carol talking about Sophia's disappearance and the mention of a Cherokee Rose, which is of course the title of the episode. And this episode really did start that infamous Carol and Daryl friendship that has been such a staple on our TV screens for over a decade now. However, outside of this 5-minute interaction, I think the overall episode is pretty weak. The group are still looking for Sophia with little progression to the main storyline. The whole Walker in a well scenario was fun, but eats up a huge portion of the screen time, and the only real payoff is that Glenn realises he wants to take better care of himself. Again, these early seasons are so hard for me because I actually pretty much love every episode I'm talking about, so I am being extremely harsh here. I just find this episode to be more stagnant than any other in season 2. Other than the Walker in the well, there is no tension or progression in any shape or form, and again, there is a lack of screen time from Rick, Shane and Carl in this episode. It feels a bit like filler, and it's sandwiched in between the reveal that Shane killed Otis, being our first murder of the entire series, coming just one episode before, and then the subsequent descent into chaos on the farm, with Shane being the catalyst for this. This episode, despite having some phenomenal moments, is overall just kind of a mid-season lull, and is truly the first case of filler in the series, I believe. Without this episode, season 2 could still exist the exact same as if it was here. And whilst it's helpful fleshing out characters in our group, particularly the character of Carol, it doesn't directly add anything to the story, which is, in my opinion, why it's the weakest in season 2. After the fall of the farm and our group's arrival at the prison, we meet the first true antagonist of the series, serving up some of the most intense scenes in the entire show. However, there are a few episodes in season 3 which I'm not a huge fan of. Firstly, episode 3, titled Walk With Me. Although this episode is vital to the overall story as we are introduced to the community of Woodbury and the infamous governor, the entire centrepiece of this episode is Andrea and Michonne, shifting the focus away from the group back at the prison, and I never really warmed to the character of Andrea, so having an entire episode in which she pretty much leads just doesn't really appeal to me. Add to the fact Michonne was a woman of few words at this point, and you get basically zero screen time from any of our main group, and the result is a pretty subpar episode in my humble opinion. But the winner for season 3 is episode 11, titled I Ain't Judas. I think the character assassination of Andrea by the writers is demonstrated perfectly by this very episode. Andrea should have been one of the most compelling characters in the entire show, especially in this season. I mean, the storyline of her getting torn between two communities, one being her old friends and the other being her new protectors, on paper sounds riveting and thought-provoking. However, it just doesn't play out that way in reality. The writers keep her in this limbo of knowing deep down the governor is a bad person, but believing in him. And this is about the 5th episode in this season that shows the exact same dilemmas. I mean, we're just going back and forth here. However, unlike the other episodes in which Andrea is torn between the two communities, in this one, it's the central theme of the entire runtime. Whilst yes, seeing Andrea interact with her old friends was interesting for a period of time, it just breaks up the palpable tension of all-out war that had been building between the two communities. This episode suffers from having far too much dialogue, not enough action, and the fatigue of Andrea. Many of the scenes lack that eerie atmosphere that the earlier episodes had, and it's just a monotonous watch, adding marginal information to what we already had. And again, I would consider this episode filler. I mean, the only thing that really happens here that adds anything to the overall narrative is the arrangement for the governor and Rick to meet up one-on-one. The worst part is, the next episode, titled Clear, is a prime example of how to correctly make a bottle episode. I mean, the title of I Ain't Judas promises betrayal, loyalty and divide, but instead we get a ton of dialogue, no real solution, and the increasingly boring Andrea storyline. For me, this is by quite a long way the weakest episode in season 3, and is probably the first episode in the entire Walking Dead that I don't actually like that much. And spoiler alert, there would be a few more to come later down the line. But I just think the quality of this episode is far beneath every other episode we'd seen thus far in the series. I mean, narratively it doesn't add anything, I think the scenes are weak, it breaks up the tension but not in a good way, and it's just a bit boring. So for all of those reasons, I Ain't Judas is in my opinion the worst episode in season 3. Season 4 of The Walking Dead would change the tone of the series forever. We see the beloved Herschel brutally killed at the hands of the governor, and the destruction of the prison, a place our group once called home. Now, unlike Season 3, there isn't an episode I don't outright dislike in this season, but there are two contenders, and probably surprising absolutely nobody, the worst episodes in Season 4 is a toss-up between episodes 6 and 7, which both exclusively feature the governor. Our group at the prison take a backseat, and for 2 hours of screen time we focus entirely on the governor. And when I say backseat, they don't appear at all. Now, these episodes follow the events of the Season 3 finale. Again, whilst I think taking the time to flesh out your central villain and dedicating a portion of the time to dissect him as a person, whilst also teasing his return, was probably the right move from a narrative perspective, I think dedicating back-to-back episodes to do so without a single look at our main group was a massive mistake from the writers. Just to put into perspective what I mean, you could watch the entirety of Shrek 1 and then start Shrek 2 in the runtime of these two episodes, in which we don't see any of our main characters other than the governor. My point is, these episodes cause the story to come to a screeching halt, but which of the two is actually worse? And my answer to that would be episode 7, titled Dead Weight, purely down to the fact it's the second episode dedicated entirely to the governor. Look, I can understand what the writers were doing, dedicating a whole episode to the governor, but back to back just seemed like an overkill to me. And I wouldn't have minded if the second governor episode flicked back and forth between our group at the prison and his new community, but once again the focus is entirely on him. The biggest problem with Deadweight is it just replays a character arc we'd already seen in Season 3 with the governor. He acts good, faces a threat, reverts to violence, and once again becomes a man consumed with rage. These episodes also kill the season's momentum, having back-to-back episodes that step away from the flu epidemic at the prison, Carol's exile, and the group's hunt for the governor himself just stalls all momentum built up from the first 5 episodes of the season. And the previous episode, Live Bait, already delves into the character of Philip Blake, so did we really need another full episode dedicated towards it? And whilst I can appreciate these episodes, although unpopular with many, are a huge reason as to why the episode Too Far Gone is so vastly successful as a mid-season finale, as standalone episodes, they do lean onto the side of boring in my opinion. That being said, I do love the cinematography, particularly in the episode Live Bait, when the governor burns down Woodbury and is past, but I think dedicating the entire runtime of 2 episodes to the governor was always going to be a risk, and ultimately, that risk just didn't pay out. Season 5 of The Walking Dead is what many regard as the peak of the franchise, but despite its colossal highs, there are also some terrible lows. The Grady Memorial storyline is arguably the most hated in the entire main show, and many episodes that contribute to this are not only poorly rated by critics, but also fans. The mid-season finale coda, whilst being overall a pretty tense and well-made episode, has the baffling death of Beth Green, which subtracted massively from its viewing experience for me. The episode Crossed is also not great, as we see our group plan Beth and Carol's rescue, but nothing significant actually happens, and it's full of sluggish dialogue. However, the clear worst episode in Season 5 for me is a no-brainer, and it's episode 4, titled Slaptown. Now, I don't know if it's because it puts an end to a legendary run of episodes that starts in Season 4 and carries all the way into Season 5, ending with 4 walls and a roof, but for the first time in a while, The Walking Dead missed the mark totally. The tone shifts from this dark and gritty survive-at-all-cost story to a cartoonish villain that feels disconnected from the overall narrative, and a flat and cliché scenario. This episode fails massively to draw me into this new community. The whole concept of a group surviving by abducting people and then forcing them to work for their freedom just seems so odd in the setting of a zombie apocalypse. Now, many of you may argue, why not choose Coda, since arguably the most pointless death in the entire series occurs in that very episode. But at least Coda had the tense standoff between the two groups, it showcased the transformation of Rick and the others, and it genuinely had some phenomenal acting in it. Slabtown lacks many of these redeeming factors. It's not interesting, I never warmed to the new community, Dawn is an underwhelming villain, and it feels totally disconnected from the main storyline. Add to this the character of Gorman, one of the cops in the hospital, might be my least favourite part of this entire episode. It feels like he was a character just invented to be an absolute menace to Beth. And I think the tone of this entire episode is totally off, which massively undermines the genuinely brilliant character development Beth had received up until this point. I think it overall kills the momentum of the season. It breaks up the action, and not in a good way, and gives us this one-dimensional storyline about a community that few people in the fanbase actually care about. Overall, this is a poor episode, and one I'd probably skip entirely on a rewatch of the series. So for those reasons, Slabtown is the worst episode in Season 5 of The Walking Dead. Season 6 of The Walking Dead gives us the tense build-up to the Saviour War, but rather than give you some dishonourable mentions for this season, to be honest, there's only one episode that stands out. I think Season 6 of The Walking Dead is often overlooked in terms of quality, because whilst albeit the peak of Season 6 isn't as high as maybe Seasons 4 and 5, but it is just consistently great throughout its 16 episode runtime. But like I said, there is only one episode I didn't really enjoy, and that is episode 5, titled Now. This episode, by all accounts, should be amazing. There's walkers surrounding Alexandria, there's a sense of foreboding doom, and there's the reveal that Maggie's pregnant. However, all this vital information is massively mishandled by the writers. The walkers, other than right at the beginning of the episode, are kept entirely off screen. Maggie, although having an interesting realisation on paper that because she's now pregnant, she can't risk her life going out to find Glenn, because it's not just her life she'd be risking, like I said, is an interesting storyline, but it just comes out rather flat on screen. And on top of this, a huge portion of this episode is dedicated to Diana, an idealist who is now realising the brutality of this new world. But in this episode, however, she is reduced to a mumbling shell of her former self, and that's my biggest problem with this episode. It's not horrible, but it's just so frustrating. The episode gives off this illusion of depth by focusing on emotion, but the emotions themselves are unearned or redundant. Maggie's sewer excursion with Aaron, for example, appears to set up a rescue arc for Glenn, but the journey ends abruptly and accomplishes absolutely nothing. Diana's crisis of faith leads nowhere, and the walkers that sit just off screen don't contribute in any way, shape or form in this episode. Now is ultimately just a pause between two storylines that accomplishes nothing of note. That being said, Aaron's development in this episode is pretty good, as well as the opening sequence, but that's about the only positives I can muster up. For an episode set in an Alexandria surrounded by thousands of walkers, the episode is surprisingly devoid of stakes and fear, and a lot of the plot points in this specific episode would either be entirely forgotten about or just lead to nothing at all. And again, I don't hate this episode, it's just on paper it should be good. Maggie's pregnancy reveal, walkers surrounding Alexandria, a delve into Diana's psychological state after her husband's death. But the execution just left a lot to be desired, and for those reasons Now, in my opinion, is the worst episode in Season 6. Season 7 of The Walking Dead has probably the most infamous debut in television history, but for the first time in this video, there are multiple episodes in this season that I'm flat out not a fan of. Firstly, the episode New Best Friends. I think the writers really missed the mark with the scavengers as a community, and the fact they speak in this broken English despite it only being like a year into the apocalypse just felt so stupid and unneeded. And whilst Jadis as a character would eventually be fleshed out by the writers, the scavengers as a whole would not be. Also, the episode Go-Getters is full of weak dialogue, pointless narrative, and serves as a mere filler episode. And finally, episode 2, titled The Well, is also incredibly weak, coming fresh off the back of Negan's introduction and the brutal lineup sequence in episode 1. Episode 2 of season 7 is basically tonal whiplash. In this episode, the tone shifts as we see the introduction of the Kingdom, watch Carol and Morgan ride horses around, and meet the theatrical king, Ezekiel. Look, this episode isn't bad, but it's just horribly misplaced, because it's not that the Kingdom shouldn't have been introduced, but the show gives us no time to grieve the losses of two of the most beloved characters in the show. I wanted to see the ripple effect on our group following the events of the lineup. I wanted to see the grieving characters and Negan's new reign. Ultimately, this episode is horribly misplaced and feels far too light-hearted considering the loss we'd endured in the previous episode. But the worst episode in Season 7 is without a doubt Episode 6, titled Swear. Now this would become the lowest rated episode in Walking Dead history, receiving just a score of 5.7 out of 10 on IMDb. And until season 10's release 3 years later, this would remain as the show's lowest rated episode in history. And to this day, it still ranks in the bottom 3. So it's comforting to know that others share my opinion. Now, season 7 of The Walking Dead is infamous for having some of the most inconsistent pacing in the entire series, whilst also mixing that in with the use of fragmented storytelling, but Swear stands out for how it completely derails the season's momentum. This episode delves into a standalone story centred around Tara and Heath, two side characters who'd been absent from the entire first half of the season, washed up on a random beach far away from the main plot. Just as tension had started to rise and a plan to fight back against Negan's regimes had started brewing, the show abandons the entire cast to focus on a subplot that absolutely nobody cared about. The concept of introducing an isolated all-female community that's men had been massacred by the Saviours sounds so intriguing, but their introduction in this episode is awfully mishandled. It's possibly the most generic storyline in fiction, a secretive group led by Netania, the strict leader, with Cindy, her granddaughter, playing the kind-hearted foil. They don't feel like real people, they never get fleshed out, and they only serve as plot points for their future involvement in season 8 of the show. We, as the audience, are given very little reason to actually care about this community, which meant by the time the writers finally decided to reuse them in the story, viewers barely even remembered who they were, because their debut episode was just so forgettable. And on top of this, Heath's disappearance with no explanation that would never be addressed in the 11 seasons of the show just added insult to injury. And look, I've never really understood all the hate that Tara got throughout her time on the show, but the fact she's the sole leader throughout this entire episode made it even more poorly received by fans. I think Swear is just a perfect storm of horrible writing. It mishandles the introduction of Oceanside, it has the controversial Tara leading the episode, it makes Heath disappear without an explanation, and it ruins the momentum of the season. Overall, the whole episode is poorly crafted and was a huge missed opportunity of introducing us to what could have been an intriguing community. So for all of those reasons, Swear is my least favourite episode in season 7 of The Walking Dead. Season 8 of The Walking Dead delves into the all-out war storyline between our survivors and the Saviours. Now this season would be the lowest the show had ever been from a critic's standpoint, and some of the episodes admittedly are pretty poor. Firstly, the King, the Widow and Rick is just a complete drag to sit through and offers nothing to the overall narrative. Episode 7, titled Time for After, I also really dislike, but that's probably due to the fact Eugene features heavily in this episode, and as you all know, I'm not the biggest fan of his character. And the elephant in the room has to be addressed in episode 9, Honor. Now, whilst I can appreciate this is AMC's biggest ever mistake, killing off Carl, I think the episode itself is fairly well done. The acting is phenomenal from Andrew Lincoln, Denai Guerrera and Chandler Riggs. The set pieces are absolutely brilliant. Seeing a now burnt down Alexandria was pretty breathtaking, and it also held immense emotional weight. Look, I could totally understand someone picking this episode as the worst in the season, and maybe even in the entire show, for what it does to the overall narrative and killing off the future of the franchise. But as a standalone episode, it's more engaging and entertaining than my pick for the worst episode in season 8. Which is exactly why it avoids that bottom spot, despite having probably the worst decision in television history in its runtime. So you may be wondering, what is the worst episode in season 8? And for me, that would be episode 3, titled Monsters. Right from the get-go, this episode struggles to find a cohesive narrative. It jumps between so many different storylines, like Rick and Daryl's, Aaron, Jesus, Tara, Gregory and Maggie's, that it just fails to give any of them sufficient screen time. This episode tries to be in too many places at once, and the result of this is a frantic, lackluster mess. It also falls culprit to its repetitive writing, something that would plague many of the later episodes in the series. I mean, Jesus refuses to kill the Saviours, Tara thinks they should all die for what they've done, and Rick battles with his conscience. These very debates carried so much weight in the earlier seasons, like Dale's speech in season 2 and Rick's plead for Herschel's life in season 4. But by this point, they had become far too repetitive, and whilst I can accept Rick's storyline for battling with his leadership, the other storylines just felt boring at this point. The title of this episode was meant to explore the idea of what kind of people war turns survivors into, aka monsters, but the show fails to live up to this promise. It has no emotional depth, the action sequences of people firing rifles behind cover and heaps of dialogue are just so poor. Then add to this my least favourite part of this episode being the reintroduction of Morales from season 1 of the show. The writers expertly utilise Morales to show a contrast between the current version of Rick Grimes and the one we saw all the way back in season 1, whilst he battles with the ideas that he might be just like Negan in terms of his leadership. Oh wait, it says on my script here that they talk for a singular minute, then Daryl comes and shoots him in the head. Like seriously, what were the writers thinking? This to me always felt like such a shame. The show spent 7 years building the mystery of Morales' fate. Fans speculated endlessly about where he'd been, how he'd survived, and if he'd joined another community. But when he finally reappears, his reveal was handled like a jump scare. He was gone in an instant, and it felt like such poor writing. Rick and Morales' meeting should have been emotionally devastating. I mean, they'd survived together from the very start, but instead, it's one-dimensional and extremely brief. I think the reason I chose this as my least favourite episode is because at least Honor had some great scenes within it. Despite the horrible decision to kill off Carl, there are some things that at least make that episode enjoyable. Monsters lacks these redeeming factors. It prematurely kills off the reintroduction of Morales, it spreads itself far too thin, has a repetitive storyline, and offers little progression from a narrative perspective. Which is why I believe this is the worst episode in season 8 of the show. Season 9 of The Walking Dead marks the end of Rick Grimes' story, in the main show at least, and introduces us to the Whisperers, an antagonist group who walk amongst the dead, as well as having a rejig behind the scenes, with AMC appointing Angela Kang to take over as showrunner. And for her first season in charge, I think she actually does a really good job. There's only 3 episodes in this season which I'm not really the biggest fan of. Firstly, episode 7. It felt like an obvious setup to the mid-season finale, has sluggish dialogue, and fails to utilise the vast array of new characters we'd been introduced to in season 9. Episode 6, titled Who Are You?, I also think isn't great, as the tone feels totally off and the show fails to introduce us to many of the new characters effectively, rendering their debut episodes as subpar and giving them an uphill battle to resonate with fans later on down the line. But the worst episode, in my opinion, is the season finale, titled The Storm. I just think this episode fails miserably as a season finale. It doesn't resolve any storylines, it doesn't get me excited to watch the next season of the show, and it's just an absolute snooze fest. And whilst I can appreciate there are some good scenes that involve Carol and Lydia and Negan and Judith, I think as a whole, this episode really isn't great. And the main problem with this season finale is it's just massively overshadowed by the episode that came before it, titled The Calm Before, because that episode in many ways does the job of the season finale. It gives us some shocking deaths, it wraps up some storylines, and sets up anticipation for the next season. The Storm had its job as a season finale done for it. I think much like my problem with The Well in season 7 is this episode is just horribly misplaced by the writers. Besides some brief remarks, no one really addresses the Pike deaths in the previous episode, Carol and Ezekiel's relationship falls apart off screen, and the pacing of the episode gives us no time for reflection. The Walking Dead season finales are infamous for either closing a chapter or opening a new one, and The Storm fails miserably at both, with the only setup for season 10 being a mysterious radio signal that felt shoehorned in at the end because the writers remembered that this was actually a season finale. Again, this episode isn't horrible, the setting of a blizzard was an interesting concept and there are some genuinely good scenes within it, but as a season finale, this just failed for me. It didn't get me excited for the new season, it didn't really address the loss in the previous episode, and there's absolutely no payoff. The Storm stands as the weakest episode in season 9 in my opinion, not because it's poorly made, but because it's misplaced, misfocused, and emotionally hollow. After a season of loss, moral complexity, and shocking twists, the finale retreats into a slow, snowbound detour that feels totally disconnected from everything we'd seen before it. So for those reasons, The Storm is my least favourite episode in season 9 of the show. I would quickly like to add though, the scene at the end of them all throwing snowballs is pretty wholesome. Season 10 of The Walking Dead might just be the biggest mixed bag in the series. Some of the episodes in this season are genuinely phenomenal, but some of them, well, are less than ideal. Now, the episode count in this season jumps all the way to 22, and there are quite a few episodes in this season that I'm not too fond of, so I'll quickly list them off before discussing the absolute train wreck that comes in bottom place. Find Me, The World Before, and Silence the Whisperers are all episodes I'm not the biggest fan of, but there are two episodes in particular that stand out for me in Season 10, with the first one being episode 20 titled Splinter. This episode is extremely lucky that another episode I will get onto exists in this season, because this, in my opinion, is the second worst episode in the entire series. It just happens to fall in the same season as my least favourite episode. Splinter is painfully poorly written and mishandles the character of Princess, someone I think the writers totally missed the mark with as a whole. As an introduction to the Commonwealth, it fails to get anybody excited for that storyline, and the episode is almost entirely set in a singular railcar, resulting in not just it being repetitive from a visual standpoint, but also from a narrative one. And as an episode, it achieves absolutely nothing. The group start off captured by the Commonwealth, and they end up captured by the Commonwealth. In the 50-minute runtime, the story doesn't change at all, and it feels like a massive waste of time, as well as just being so incredibly boring to sit through. But without a doubt, the worst episode in Season 10 of The Walking Dead is episode 21, titled Diverged. Not only is this the lowest rated episode in Walking Dead history, but it also is one of the lowest rated episodes from mainstream television programs in general. It's that bad. And the fact AMC dropped this back to back with Splinter is absolutely mental. And those 2 weeks were a tough time to be a Walking Dead fan. Now, as a disclaimer, this episode and Splinter were a part of the bonus episodes AMC shot in the pandemic, so there were of course filming restrictions. But I genuinely think giving us no episode at all would have been better than this. And the fact this even left the drawing board just baffles me. The whole premise of this episode is that Daryl and Carol have an argument and go off on their own separate ways, hence the title Diverged. But then we follow the pair separately doing mundane tasks. Now strap in, because this is the exhilarating part of the episode. We watch Daryl fix his motorcycle and Carol catch a rat. Yes, that is it. There's no conflict, there's no tension, there's little dialogue, no narrative progression. It's literally just two people doing mundane chores in absolute silence. This is the definition of a filler episode, and despite me doing 3 rewatches of the entire Walking Dead, this is an episode I've only ever seen once, because I will always skip it. The worst part is, when this was released, fans eagerly waited each week for a new episode, so you can imagine mine and many others' disappointment when this was the episode we got. It was just terrible. There's no plot, there's no dialogue, a boring premise, and it is ultimately just a huge waste of time. So for all those reasons, Diverged is without a doubt the worst episode in Season 10 and the entire Walking Dead series. Season 11 would be the final in the Walking Dead main series, and this one is actually quite hard to rank, because whilst there are some pretty good episodes in Season 11, a lot of them are just pretty mediocre, meaning I don't love them, but I also don't dislike them. I think my least favourite episode in this season, however, is probably Variance. Again, not because it's a bad episode, but for its wasted potential. Much like why I chose the episode Monsters in Season 8, the premise to this episode is phenomenal, but the execution is lackluster. The introduction of variant walkers should have been built up over time, but instead the episode abruptly reintroduces them, causing their inclusion to feel desperate and an attempt from the writers to inject a new concept into the series. Frank Darabont's more capable walkers are some of the highlights from Season 1 of the show for me. so I definitely think Variant Walkers was without a doubt the correct decision from a narrative perspective. But not only does their introduction feel rushed, but the whole concept just felt so underutilised. After this episode, we never get a reason as to why they exist, and the characters in the story never address it or seem to care about it. Add to the fact that this was episode 19 in the season, which I personally think is far too late to be experimenting with new concepts as you lead up to the season finale, and what you get is just a bit of a mess. Variant Walkers should have been teased early on in season 11 if the writers knew they wanted to do it, and then they could have built them up to have their eventual involvement in the breach of the Commonwealth, but instead they feel awkwardly shoehorned in with zero explanation, and it's a massive shame because they could have used these Variant Walkers to create some genuinely terrifying scenes with some of our characters, but instead they appear very briefly, kill a few no-named characters, and then vanish forever. So I think for the what could have been aspect, Variant is my least favourite episode in season 11. It is ultimately a mediocre episode with some good moments in it, especially from Aaron, but it could have been so much more than this, which is why I've ranked it as my least favourite episode in season 11. And with that being said, those are my picks for the worst episode in every single season of The Walking Dead. I would like to quickly say many of these episodes I don't actually dislike, they are just the worst in their respective seasons. Except for you, Diverged, I will never forgive you for wasting an hour of my life. But please do let me know down below in the comments if you agree with my list or if you'd make any changes to it. I would also like to apologise for the delay in today's video. I've been quite ill recently, as you can probably hear from my voice, so it's meant I've had to push back recording this video. But if you have enjoyed it, please do like and subscribe as it helps the channel out massively, and we are quickly closing in on 30,000 subscribers. But once again, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Goodbye.